Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today on the podcast is Ted Peters, Lutheran theologian, spent a lot of time engaging science and religion, and a regular public theologian engaging the Christian tradition in all sorts of conversations in the public square. Now, he's a Substacker as well. And I'll say, the author of my favorite one-volume Christian systematic theology text, God, the Future of the World. It is a form of constructive postmodernism that doesn't deflate the distinctive Christian claims at the heart of the tradition and communicates it in a very engaging way for students. So, very excited for you to be here, Ted.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Trip. It's always great to have a trip with Trip.
Well, today on your Substack, you were pulling together a whole host of threads now that the president's former and current president decided that maybe we should release some info on encounters with extraterrestrial life. So I'd love for someone who's been kind of thinking about this theologically and engaged with it in the public square for years to maybe begin by letting us know your own story with it, like how you found interest and what does it look like over the years as a Christian theologian engaging different disciplines in the public square around the search for extraterrestrial life.
Well, having two presidents suddenly say, oh, we're going to release the secret files that will tell us about the U.S. government's debunking and secretizing all this exotic information about flying saucers, UFOs, UAP, crashed spacecraft, the storing of the bodies of dead aliens, and conversations between an alien civilization and the U.S. military. I don't know, I'm sitting on the front of my seat biting my fingernails. But wait a minute, this has been going on for 75 years without any change. Go back to 1950 and Don Kehoe's book, Behind the Flying Saucer, starts right off. Why won't the government release this information? And so if you think the Epstein files is sort of mysterious, let me tell you, this is the same thing with a great deal more frustration and mystery. So why am I in this? Well, when I was a kid, I read Donald Kehoe. I read the UFO books, the flying saucer books. And my mom and dad were followers of George Adamski. You weren't even born during that era, Trip, but he was a cultist of a sort, a contactee from a civilization on Venus where people looked and talked kind of like Jesus. Later, we found out the surface temperature of Venus is 950 degrees, so that's a little less like heaven and a good deal more like the other place. But I've been active as a UFO investigator on and off now for a long period of time, and I try to do an analysis of our culture. Why is it that so many people are so excited, A, about a mystery that's unresolved, and B, the prospect that we share our cosmos with intelligent space neighbors? And that's what keeps me animated, Trip.
Yeah, and you coined the term astrotheology. So I wonder when did you realize the kind of space sciences broadly were posing genuinely new theological questions and not just, illustrations so we could, recapitulate old answers?
The term astrobiology came online about 1995 or so. Prior to that, Carl Sagan and others had called it exobiology. And Sagan would even joke, it's a science that has nothing to study because nobody has in their hand a living exo creature or anything. But with the discovery of exoplanets in the 1990s, astrobiology came online. I had flirted with the term exotheology earlier, then reframed it 15 years ago in terms of astrotheology on the grounds that we want theologians to think about the implications of off-Earth non-human intelligence. And a number of people have been able to work under the umbrella of astrotheology and astroethics, sometimes called just space ethics.
And one of the things that you do, and this runs not just around this topic, but generally when thinking about public theology, is recognizing like what are the major loci that Christians have always kind of reflected on are kind of most entangled in these new questions. And when it goes to astrotheology, you're always wanting to help it reshape our theology of nature. And you got to make sure that, especially engaging the public, like I'm not talking about like a new age or occult thing. I'm not talking about astrology, because the moment you say astro, especially in California, certain things come to mind first. But I wonder if you could kind of talk, having been engaged in these conversations for a while, what are we inheriting in a new way when in our doctrine of creation if we start to ask these more intergalactic questions?
Well, you asked that question well. My working definition of public theology is that it's theology that is conceived originally in the church, is critically honed and developed in the academy or the university, and then finally is shared with the public outside the church for the sake of the common good. And there are, as you had suggested in your question, doctrines, Christian systematic theology doctrines that have been carefully thought about for 2,000 years that are very enlightening, very illuminating. And if we in the church share those doctrines outside the church, they can help public discourse, in particular, sin and grace in Christian thinking illuminates the political crisis. Why is it that public officials who plan on perpetrating violence do so in the name of justice? Why? Well, the doctrine of sin illuminates that. As you suggested, when we deal with questions about life on other planets, what's the nature of the cosmos? Yes, the Christian doctrine of creation, or it's a doctrine we share with Muslims and Jews to be sure, is illuminating because as believers in God, we want to see the unity. And if the cosmos is expanding, almost disintegrating, in terms of by the principle of entropy and the dissipation and tending towards a final state of equilibrium in which nothing happens. How do we understand that if there is a single God and a single world and that all of this is very meaningful? So there's an opportunity right here for theologians in at least these three traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to engage the wider public, especially through the lenses shared with us by the natural scientists. Hey, what does it all mean? And I have to say, I really enjoyed your conversation with Andrew Davis, who can rely on white-headed metaphysics and say, you know what, the meaning's there. It's already there. What we need to do is we need to find it. And so I think the public theologian can help in conversations way outside the church. How do we find the meaning that holds all of this complex cosmos, all the parts of it together?
Even there about the kind of like value of life in general being something that's not just, well, hopefully we've gotten over it just being something our species has, or even life on our planet. You have this concept of teleoempathy, right? This felt sense of another being's trajectory is something to think about ethically that, could be used towards thinking about life, even at the microbial level on our planet, or like in parts of the ocean maybe we haven't thought through, and these kinds of things. Last night, I was chaperoning a youth group trip to where we got to use a satellite. I mean, a giant telescope. Yeah. And one of the things we looked at was Europa.
Nice.
And the astrophysicist there was talking about, for the longest time, we thought Europa is this odd moon because there's hardly any dents on it. Well, why is that? And then it comes to find out that Europa is running at a different angle around the planet, and when it passes another moon, it contracts and then expands, and it generates a lot of heat in Europa. So when things hit it, it goes through the ice, and then, if the surface is minus 2,000 something degrees, the water will come up, freeze almost immediately, right? And that which just that one moon is a shock to all of our assumptions as to what's out there. And going, well, now we have this smooth surface moon, but in the middle of it, it's a lot warmer and it's a liquid, right? And so I wondered, how even thinking around those ethical concepts like teleoempathy help us think about maybe the ethical categories we've used for thinking about endangered species or something on Earth as a way of thinking about a life found elsewhere that may not even be as advanced as we are now, but a site of life in the universe that gets the dignity that in our doctrine of creation we've been wanting to give to our non-human neighbors.
Well, astrobiologists tend to divide their discipline into two categories: extraterrestrial non-intelligent life, or as Margaret Rayson said, he would say stupid life, within the solar system, and then intelligent life, which is the only type of life we're probably going to discover out of the solar system elsewhere within the Milky Way. And so when it comes to non-intelligent life within the solar system, and astrobiologists think that Europa is probably one among the half dozen locations where we're most likely to encounter microbes, ethical questions arise. How much empathy? And I was at a meeting some years ago with a bunch of astrobiologists who were asking the ethical question: would those microbes somewhere on Europa, maybe right in that little Goldilocks temperature zone where it's not 2,000 degrees below zero, where there is liquid water and there might be single cell organisms or maybe even mosquito larvae, who knows, do they have intrinsic value? Now, it's just formula a little more complex. Probably individual microbes don't. I mean, we wash our hands in alcohol, right, to kill them. But what about the biosphere? What about the whole ecosphere that makes these living creatures? Do we have a moral obligation to protect that ecosphere? This was the kind of question the scientists were asking. And I'm thinking, as a theologian, oh, be still my heart. It's so wonderful to hear scientists asking moral questions of such profundity. And then as the conversation went on, I had to go, oops. They want public policy that protects Europa so that it's the sandbox that scientists can play in. They don't want Elon Musk or the Mars Society to go there with bulldozers and start mining it for profit and killing those poor microbes. So here was a kind of utilitarian or potential reason to get the philosophers to provide a justification for putting a fence around it for the scientists. Be that as it may, it just shows that this kind of anticipation of new scientific discoveries provokes moral questions, and we got a ways to go before we resolve them, but it's going to be fun.
Oh, yeah.
But it's going to be power against power, as it so frequently is in terms of discerning, well, what is really the right way to go?
Mm-hmm. Well, and even that's a good example of one of the kind of concepts you and Bob Russell developed of creative mutual interaction when thinking about kind of the theology engaging the sciences in different ways. It's someone who's kind of thought about that intersection of theology and science and done so where you get grants to bring all the cool scientists to hang out with religion scholars and such. What are some of those kind of places of creative mutual interaction that show up in the conversation about astrobiology more broadly?
There are two questions there. Creative mutual interaction, phrase coined by Robert John Russell, as you mentioned, who is a hybrid. He's both a physicist and a systematic theologian. He's really talking about subatomic activity, where at the most fundamental level of reality, it appears we have indeterminacy. And that's sort of a or funny situation because natural scientists in general tend to be causal determinists. So here we have indeterminacy way down there at the basics. And so Robert John wants to say this is a real opening where the theologian can talk about divine providence at work in the physical world in which no laws of nature are violated. You don't have to appeal to a miracle in order to show how God is at work. And so science informs theology, and theology informs science. So that's the level at which creative mutual interaction works. Now, at the practical level, what Bob does that has really taught me a lot is he'll lock 6 scientists and 6 theologians in a room, have coffee set in, and then we just knock heads. And that has been quite an adventure over the last 50 years. And I really credit Bob at the Center for its leadership in creative mutual interaction. Similarly, when it comes to astrotheology, on the one hand, the astrotheology is a religious reflection on what the scientists tell us about outer space. On the other hand, as I had suggested earlier, what does the theologian bring to the table here that could be of value to the scientific community? And up until this point, it's been basically value, morality, ethics, etc. But you started by asking me about a theology of nature. Would the theologian construct a theology of nature that benefits from what the scientists tell us about nature, yet adds something of value? And I think that's the kind of thing that Andrew Davis was exploring with you earlier, and he was importing Whiteheadian metaphysics so that we could say to the scientists, look for value. Nature is telling us something about value. Or Hans Jonas, whom you discussed earlier, similarly in evolutionary biology, says life strives to preserve itself. Listen, y'all, that's the source of value right there. And your and my moral obligation is to respond to life trying to preserve itself, etc. So the theologian can bring, and the philosopher too, bring to the wider discussion of what is the nature of nature, the question of what should be valued, and etc. Is this already done? Oh, no, this is a research program. It's just beginning. That has a long way to go.
Well, you talk about how astrobiology is an almost religious science, that it's hard to maintain kind of the strict scientific lines of objectivity when you get to something that entails, right, the kind of metaphysical and cosmological questions that come up. And I wonder if there's something for people of faith to learn when engaging in those kind of, almost religious science questions. It provokes one more sight for us to wrestle with the need to decenter humanity from, the sole locus of divine engagement. But, there might be others that, elements that come up for you.
There are actually 2 questions there. Why is astrobiology an almost religious science? And the second one is, do we need to decenter, de-anthropocentrize? Let me deal with the first one first. I guess the answer is all. I don't know if you were a teenager laying on the beach like I was, looking up at the sky. Charlie Brown used to do this in the cartoons. And you look beyond the clouds. What do you perceive? It's kind of like it's there, but it's not there. It's infinite. And in the ancient archaic cultures, the sky was sacred. It was powerful. The sun could make alive or destroy. The clouds could foment and roar with thunder and spark with lightning. And when I heard that as a kid, I'd run and hide under my bed. My mother would say, "Why are you under the bed?" I said, "I'm afraid of the thunder." And she would say, "Oh, don't worry. It's just Thor up in heaven rolling his bowling ball. So the sky had this enormous sense of power and infinity. And then in the modern world, we disenchantized it. We have weather reports that tell us what the sky is going to do all week. And we fly in airplanes. We look down on the rain. And, oh my gosh, the sky lost this numinous quality. But surprise of all surprises, right behind the sky was another one, namely outer space. And once we discovered outer space, that has we almost experience infinity when we look at the stars at night, or if you look at the galaxies through telescopes. And the scientists can capitalize on this. Carl Sagan, brutal atheist, oh my gosh, astronomy and speculation about space gave him all the religious meaning he needed without being religious. Now, think of the Contact drama, and he even includes Resurrection of the Dead in there. So I want to say that astronomy, astrophysics, astrobiology, these are scientists that intrinsically excite us. And when I'm watching a news show and they say, oh, there's been a new discovery that, of a new planet or something, man, I'm going to sit through the commercials in order to get to that new discovery. So that's what I mean, is the sky picks up a luminous quality that we've inherited from our ancestors. And that's got nothing to do with the facts of astronomy. That has to do with just the confrontation of the finite with the infinite.
Yeah, is someone who's not just engaged in the kind of the larger academic conversation, but someone who spends a lot of time both writing and speaking to congregations and in larger public. What are the most frequent questions that you get asked around extraterrestrial life and these kinds of things that you think, oh, that is an excellent question, and let's talk about it, and the ones that you go, well, as a theologian of the church, let me help you reframe it. What have you learned from so much time interacting with so many different people in the public about it?
Well, if the subject matter happens to be UFOs, I talked to a 12 or 13-year-old boy because they got it all in their mind. It's almost like a set of tropes that these, they're like flying saucers, are kind of like airplanes or spaceships that travel from planet to planet. And of course, that's partially informed by science fiction, which I happen to think is almost irrelevant to the larger question of extraterrestrial intelligence and UFOs, etc. But there's a certain kind of mindset that puts it all together, and then you debate whether it's true or false. So the largest set of questions comes from that, and most grown-ups that I know never actually had a new thought after they were 12 anyway about this particular subject matter. I think when it comes to grown-ups, they're trying to put together a number of disparate pieces. And you said earlier you want to talk about serious science, serious theology, and New Age stuff. But in terms of what's available for you and me in the culture, on the one hand, we've got the serious scientific questions. On the other hand, you got claims of the paranormal. You've got life after life experiences. And these things sort of come together in people's minds, and it's not automatic. It's just there in the culture. And we want to get them all together. And I remember talking with a UFO experiencer one time, a woman, and she said that after her UFO experience, an alien has entered her mind through her brain, and he's there with her all the time. And she can consult with him about daily life and how to sort things out. So I just want to say, I think that there's a propensity that we have to take a disintegrated set of thoughts and integrate them. And speculation about ETI is one of the places in which that happens. Andrew Davis does it in light of Whiteheadian metaphysics. St. Thomas Aquinas did it in light of St. Thomas Aquinas' metaphysics. And they kind of roll together in a package. And you're in my natural inclination and thinking is trying to put it all together. And that's why the public theologian, I think, is in the job, in my opinion, of worldview construction. It's our task to try to put it together, but all these things don't fit easily.
One of the things that I've experienced is in these kind of conversations that a certain part of the church, especially the kind of more biblical literalist types, insist, oh, well, the Bible is clear. Like, there's not extraterrestrial life and such. And you call your stance the Bible welcomes alien stance. So like knowing that we're going to have increasing situations where congregants go up to their clergy or their nerdy friends and ask about this. Like, where's the ideal place of beginning to make space for it for those that think it's just kind of a priori eliminated by Scripture?
Well, let me say, I've not run into the kind of person you're talking about. I did do a survey some years ago of religious people and what they thought in terms of their faith about extraterrestrials. And evangelicals and fundamentalists, including a number of Christian fundamentalists, they said again and again and again, God is the creator of everything that is. And if God created civilizations on other planets, well, that's the kind of powerful God I believe in. And there was not a general, at least that I could perceive, a general rejection of the possibility of sharing our universe with space neighbors on the part of fundamentalists. There is a small group, however, of Christian fundamentalists and a little bit in the Islamic tradition as well, who believe that flying saucers, UFOs, are demonic. And Satan actually is tempting you and me to believe there are aliens. Why would Satan want to do that? Well, I tell you, I'm a researcher, so I investigated these people. Come on, tell me. And at bottom, you know what it is? Evolution. Because those Darwinists believe that evolution happens on Earth and everywhere else. And if you and I believe there are highly evolved space aliens, we are going to be susceptible to believing in evolution. And we know that Charles Darwin evolution came from Satan. It just knocked my socks off to hear that argument because it violates the principle of parsimony. I mean, it's so unnecessarily complex. But I really found that to be a fringe argument. A few Protestant fundamentalists, at least one or two Orthodox people. I've not seen it in a Roman Catholic position yet.
I think you're right that if you were convinced that life evolved and is evolving in a multiplicity of different inhabitable planets or moons and such, that it's not just a threat to a kind of anthropocentrism and a kind of narrow account of salvation or the incarnation and these kinds of things. It also has the side effect of going, well, that really does problematize without Darwin's help, a kind of narrow account of humanity as the crown of creation.
Let's take up the anthropocentrism. And you and Andrew Davis had a nice discussion of it. And both you and Dr. Davis assume there's something wrong with anthropocentrism. Let me elaborate a little bit. Where does that come from? It comes from the so-called Copernican principle. And allegedly, and there are many scientists, I think Bondi might be the guy who coined the phrase Copernican principle. It goes something like this. Before Copernicus, the Catholic Church and the human race thought that the human being was the center of everything. Then, when we put the sun in the center of the heliocentric universe and Earth became marginalized, it deflated human pride in such a way that we found ourselves to be marginalized. Therefore, it follows, morally, ethically, in terms of our value system, we should feel insignificant. And Bondi says, and this is a fundamental principle of science. Pardon me, there's a fallacy there. The fallacy is that being geographically marginalized means philosophically that we're marginalized and insignificant. That's a naturalistic fallacy. You don't get an ought from an is. Nature doesn't tell you what the value is, even though certainly white-headed metaphysics would suggest that. Given the way modern science developed, modern science is supposed to be value-free. That's both its problem and its glory, because, it's so powerful in discovering that physical causality. But if science is value-free, then the Copernican principle is clearly fallacious. And the scientists cannot tell us whether human beings are in the center or peripheral, because it doesn't deal with values. So that's one of the reasons why I want to demote the Copernican principle. That's not an argument for human centricity. It may turn out to be the case that we will meet extraterrestrials on an exoplanet who are superior to us morally, intellectually, artistically. And we may then find out, hey, we really are second rate. We haven't done that yet. And I don't think there's a good philosophical reason for leaping to that position without the empirical evidence to back it up. So my bottom line is, put anthropocentrism in brackets. Let's look and see.
How does that shape the way you think through the incarnation? Especially in the uniqueness of the self-revelation in a particular human in a particular time on this particular planet and these kinds of things, how does understanding the incarnation change the way we would think through the God-world relationship on, say, other biological timelines of sorts elsewhere?
There are two different kinds of answers to that. The first one is, I'm a disciple of Niels Henrik Gregersen. I don't know if you know him, at the University of Copenhagen. He has, in light of these issues, given us what he calls deep incarnation. So in Jesus of Nazareth, God is incarnate not just in his mind, not just in his conscience, not just in the color of his hair, but every physical, biological component of Jesus is made up of the same stuff that the whole cosmos is, including the stardust and whatever elements we're going to find on an exoplanet.
And that's where, when he's thinking about, say, like the prologue of John, it's the word became sarx, not
That's right,
soma.
sarx. That's right. Yeah. The logos becomes sarx, flesh. And he wants to emphasize that with a sledgehammer. And so the redemptive power of God incarnate in Jesus applies to everything in the cosmos, no matter how far away it is or how separated it is in time. And God loves the physical world as well as the mental or conscious world. So let me just say that's the first answer. Now, the second answer has to do with a slightly different formulation of your question that we have run into a lot. By we, I mean my colleagues at the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences who are doing astrotheology. And that is there a warrant for believing that God would have multiple incarnations, one for each intelligent civilization on another planet? Or does the single incarnation in Jesus Christ in the history of life on Earth suffice for the cosmos? So in our book on astrotheology, I got people on both sides to argue with each other about which view is better. I tend to side, and I think Niels Henrik Gregersen gives me good reason with deep incarnation to go with a single incarnation for the whole cosmos. How God connects it all together is God's business. But Paul Tillich, no minor league theologian, who goes for the multiple incarnations on the grounds that every intelligent species needs to have an experience of revelation that God who created us is also a gracious. And so note that's a revelation kind of atonement theory. So I think the argument is still roaring. I don't know how to resolve it definitively, but I think it's probably healthy for theologians to get in the boxing ring and punch each other on this particular issue.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask something nerdy that I'm just thinking of. So I didn't write this question down.
nerdy stuff.
So one of the things that a lot of process thinkers will do when thinking about this, right, they would be framing the possibility of, you know, how like John Cobb talks about God, Jesus internalizing the primordial nature of God, like the full fidelity of Jesus. So he makes material the divine insistence such that his life is the image of the invisible God. And because of that, because of the metaphysical framing of process thought, you have a way of thinking, well, he's the exemplification and the full participation of the divine lure moment to moment. And if we think life evolves to have that kind of deep aesthetic possibility elsewhere, the invitation in every moment of becoming would have its own history there, right? And so one analogy we might think of in a process framing of thinking about other life would be similar to how we think about engaging other wisdom traditions that had these huge histories apart from each other for much of human history. And so when you think of kind of like the Christian Buddhist dialogue, there's these spaces of creative mutual transformation where kind of the gifts and focus within the Christian tradition on the particular, the material for justice, these kinds of things become a gift to give to one, in the same way that the Buddhist tradition has spent time honing and practice and narratives and thought, a kind of a responsiveness to our interconnectivity to the whole, creativity in Whitehead. And you know, that could be a fruitful way of thinking it. And I wonder, as someone who in their kind of the principle of possibility that comes to each moment is in a proleptic frame, like in your own work, like what are the kind of resonances of similarity there? And what does the invitation of possibility moment to moment, being from the world's future and not just our planet in God, how does that create kind of a contrast for maybe, you know, if you and Andrew were hanging out arguing about this or something, in which we can arrange these.
Yeah, well, Andrew and I probably agree on 97% of these kinds of commitments. And
that's why the 3% is fun to argue about with nerds.
Right. I have an enormous admiration for the Whiteheadians, but I never converted completely. A couple responses to your disquisition there. John Cobb, Schubert Ogden, Whiteheadians of this nature tend to have a revelatory or revelation atonement theory. That is to say, the task of Jesus Christ is to reveal to you and me the truth that is everlasting about God. It's fun. Christ doesn't do any work in the way of forgiving sins or something like that, or rising from the dead. Christ simply reveals what's always true about God, that God is boundless love. And you're right that great wisdom, or knowledge that leads to wisdom, is in principle available anywhere within any historical setting. I have to tell you, and this probably applies to you as it does me, I have such admiration for John Cobb. He was so creative. And I did attend a couple Buddhist Christian dialogues where John was a leader, and he was open to learning from the Buddhists, especially Japanese Buddhists, etc., while sharing. And it is true that he felt it was his Christian responsibility to know and understand in a charitable, empathetic, and loving way. And he modeled that as a person as well.
He took the not bearing false witness part very seriously.
Mm-hmm. And in our cultural crisis, as you well know, boy, truth and authenticity, these things are hard to come by in a post-truth, false facts lying to the public kind of era. So John and Schubert and all the process thinkers really, that I know, really do exhibit in their own moral stature the qualities that our whole society benefits from. And by the way, I don't have any stock in their company or that's where we need to have a slight shift. And this is why I am not a Whiteheadian. The Whiteheadian metaphysical principles are always at work. And that's why you can't have an eschatology if you're a Whitehead. You can't have anything that happens that's really new. Everything is relatively new, but not really new. So I use the category of history rather than metaphysics for fundamental reality. And with history, every event is going to be unique. Oh, yes, it shares some structures with past events, but it's going to be unique. God, who created the world from the beginning out of nothing, is in the business of transforming it, even right now in this minute. And Trip, you are contributing to God's transformation of the cosmos with every puff of that cigar. By the way, I wanted to, you got a cigar for North Carolina tobacco. I wanted to hold up a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon for California, but it's too early in the morning for me.
It's a little early.
The proleptic view is that God is going to do something in the future that is radically new, so transformative that some of what God does not have precedent. Some does. And looking for the precedence of God's future action now, that's what I mean by prolepsis. So like the Whiteheadians, reality is dynamic. It's becoming, as you pointed out. It's not being, it is becoming. And the future is going to be different from the past. Okay. But there's a certain fundamental change that God has promised, one item of which is resurrection of the dead. Right now, the dead stay dead. But when God raised Jesus from the dead on Easter Sunday, God is promising, by the way, sometime in the future, the dead don't stay dead anymore. And God's going to have to act in a way contrary to nature, but then the new laws of nature, God's going to have to act for redemption. And so that's kind of the vortex there, or hinge, that distinguishes me from the Whiteheadians, even though I think both myself and Andrew Davis believe that the world we live in is dynamic and not static.
Yeah. Oftentimes there's a conversation around the need to prepare people for the recognition of extraterrestrial life.
Right.
You even mentioned Spielberg's upcoming movie, which based at least on the what you discover online if you're pumped about him making a new science fiction film is there. If you think about that conversation and what would it look like to a congregation or prepare a church? What are if we think of that conversation around preparing the public and the questions that will arise in the tradition, people of faith, and the more just existential ones that show up, what kind of advice do you give when you're working with future clergy and stuff around this topic?
Well, I think the first thing to do is, when planning a covered dish dinner in the church basement, to have a few extra chairs in case some aliens show up. Or to say it a little bit more abstractly, I think our disposition should be good hospitality. And I know that Americans and some Europeans these days don't like aliens crossing their borders. But the Bible says, welcome the sojourner. And we should think of any visitors that step out of a flying saucer on their Rhodes Scholar tours here should be invited to our covered dish dinner and a Jell-O salad, etc. Now, there is a reasonable issue, a reasonable thought scenario that should give us some caution. As I pointed out in my research and study, by and large, people who have UFO experiences and who speculate about what kind of creatures those intelligent aliens are going to be, it's almost always positive. And it has to do with another giant fallacy in our thinking, namely that more highly advanced intelligences will be more highly advanced in science and also more highly advanced in morality. They're going to be loving. And so if you think that science is the savior of civilization, extraterrestrial science that's more highly advanced will really save us from ourselves. I call that the ETI myth. So that's widespread. And I would be a little bit cautious about that. Until we meet them, we don't know. We don't know. And it is possible, not likely, but it is possible for them to be violent, for them to be conquerors as well. And if so, there might be some good reason to have defense alternative at work. But like I say, the one answer I'm going to give to your question is be hospitable, not hostile.
So one of the kind of like fun places of thinking about kind of theology and ethics in this is the question around colonizing Mars or terraforming Mars. When you've discussed terraforming Mars, that's one of the places you think about the created co-creators of God. And so I wonder if, reshaping a, at least currently based on what we know, more or less dead planet into a living one, like, how do you understand that theologically? Like, you could imagine people like, what a great act of worship, participating in God's ongoing creation in this new place, or it could be like the ultimate Promethean overreach. And so, like, if we're just, thinking about what to do in reaching out beyond our own our planet, like, what comes to mind?
Well, I love the fact you mentioned the risk of Promethean overreach. We need to be cautious about that. That notwithstanding, I admire the Mars Society or Elon Musk or those who think about settling a colony on Mars. Or you mentioned terraforming. That's the idea of Christopher McKay at NASA, who thinks that if we were to put plants on Mars that give off oxygen, enough of them, we could make Mars habitable for human beings in less than a century. And then it could become a second Earth. I love that big thinking. We need more really big thinkers. Is it going to be easy? No. But why not try some difficult things? One of the areas that some of my colleagues have been looking at over the last 10 years is what would it take to make human beings adaptable for life on Mars? Well, more than likely, and here I work with a friend named Arvin Gauss, a geneticist, more than likely we would have to modify the genomes of the Earthlings who go to Mars because they're going to have lower gravity, artificial oxygen for a period of time, and their bodies are going to look different. Their muscles will atrophy, and they won't be able to come home again. Once they go to Mars and live there and adapt, they're not coming home. Are they still human? Or are they a different species? And, that'll keep the philosophers earning an honest living, I think, for a period of time. But let me just say, I'm kind of gung-ho for people with really big ideas. The Promethean overreach risk that you mentioned would be if we expect too much. If we really expect that somehow or other Martians will become more moral than we are, or more interesting than we are, or then you might end up with the kind of overreach that would produce a tragedy.
In one of the things that I think is pretty easy to worry about if we just imagine forward the colonization of Mars is that those doing it are going to be driven by the kind of profit motive and these kinds of things that in getting there. And I wonder, what are the gifts religious traditions or kind of theological ethics and such can give for like intentionally trying to design a new society under a new space to have a kind of a more just framing for it than is often, well, at least we experience here, especially thinking of our history as a species, and even the church has often, discovered new worlds, shown up and brought way more than the good news of Jesus Christ with them. They brought a lot of death, pestilence, domination, and all sorts of other stuff.
Well, I certainly hope that if we discover living microbes on Mars, that some visiting Earthling will tell them that Jesus loves them. I think, as you suggested in your question, reviewing our own history could be very enlightening. If we take a look at Western civilization in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, Christians wanted everyone on earth to enjoy the kingdom of God. Could we restructure society so that the blessings of the kingdom of God could imbue all the social structures and benefit everybody, especially the poorest of the poor and those who are marginalized? And so things that we took for granted for a while, justice, democracy, equality, dignity. I mean, even those who weren't Christian adopted these as their mission, so to speak, and their et cetera. And it really has had a transforming effect. Did the kingdom of God arrive? Well, not in its fullest, no. Basically, it arrived like the prophet who says, society on earth is falling short of the kingdom of God. We still have a lot more work yet to do. So I think this is one of the positive thrusts within the long story of Christian mission. Oh, yes, there are many factors involved here, but that is the positive thrust. And then as we look back, oh my gosh, can we see the failings of our ancestors? They failed to combat slavery. They failed to combat the usurpation of human dignity by kings. And we can render a harsh judgment even on our own tradition. And I think that's the prophetic part of interpreting all history, not just Christian history. So again, with regard to Mars colonization or settling Mars, we probably should try to design a society that maximizes justice, equality, dignity, freedom, etc. Design it with those values. But we'll probably also have to have a police force, hopefully a small one, but we're going to have a police force. Why? Well, what we've learned from history is that self-interest in individuals and groups can rob the common good so that other people suffer. And somehow or other, you need to police that activity on behalf of the common good of the whole body politic.
Have you read Brian McLaren's recent fiction book, The Last Voyage?
I have not. Sorry.
Oh, well, there's it's the first of a trilogy of the first human settlement on Mars.
Whoa,
and
good.
One of the characters in it has what sounds like the coolest job description of all time, is being hired after they started settling it, and they're having all these troubles, like suicide among people there. The kind of archetype of rationalist community is having meaning problems. On the last group going, before kind of the doors shut on the community, they hire a philosopher of religion to go. And it's one of the main characters.
Okay.
But it has me thinking, like, the book has a sense of the kinds of tasks we think of, or something like that, is missing really the gift of the humanities, religious traditions, these kinds of things, the need for rituals, narratives, communities of meaning, this stuff. And I just kept thinking that, I was like, oh, I bet Ted would like that job.
Yes, I would like that job. It reminds me, it was some years ago, I was talking with a NASA engineer in Atlanta. I don't know what NASA engineer in Atlanta, but he gave me a soapbox sermon, even though we're the only two in the room. He says, when we send the first colony to Mars, we'll make sure that nobody on it is religious. I said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, in the history of life on Earth, it's religious people are responsible for all the violence, the fighting, and the warfare. And if we won't have peace on Earth until people stop being religious, so all the astronauts we select have to be non-religious when they start life on Mars. And I said to him, okay, well, that's good. You can have all these non-religious astronauts, but an hour and a half after they've landed on Mars, they'll create their own religion. So
Yeah.
I hope we have more than just engineers deciding who goes to Mars. And you're right. They're going to have at least one philosopher.
So thinking about your Substack posts from today, well, today when we're recording, for those of you listening later, like if tomorrow NASA announced the confirmed contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence, what do you think the first thing you would say theologically would be? Do you have a draft of the posts?
Boy, that's a good question, because of course I'm going to have 100 questions for the space alien that will probably exhaust them about all of that kind of thing. And I don't know what my trip. What would be your first question you're going to ask that space visitor?
Oh, I want to know what was the last time they did the equivalent of crying, like what animated it.
So you want to get to their heart and their soul, huh?
Yeah, like what moves you,
Right.
Like we have, like I couldn't. It's hard to imagine a culture that develops technologically and socially that could go between planets, not having something that binds communities, right? Where you have cost signaling activities to develop it and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
But when we look at like the emergence of religion in our species, we were doing shamanic dancing, rituals, all sorts of stuff before we even had language.
No.
And then if we look at the big history of us as a species, we hit a wall when our narrative structure culturally doesn't match the challenges we face, and then they have to develop. And so there's always this sense of like what has seized you in some sense, be it you could say like, oh, I was cuddling with my kid or grandkid and we watched a Disney Pixar film and there's this beautiful like love and that made me start tearing up, or it could have been forgiveness, or it could have been like the sheer, like they could be their first contact with someone else and going like, life is so much bigger. It could be this big joy of but like knowing there's so many elements of communication and culture. It's like, how do you move it past? Well, what was the thing that seized you? Right. And then maybe the next one be like, what made you say yes to this journey? Right. Was it a necessity because of the conditions you're coming from? Was it they asked someone to raise their hand, no one did for 5 minutes, and then you were like, all right, I'm doing it. The existential drivers would be like the most fascinating thing to me. And if they do have music, I want to listen. Like, and then I want to know, knowing like our music scale that we're most familiar with and have learned to listen to is not the only one that humans have ever had. And if you hear, like, if you hang out with an ethnomusicologist, they'll play music that to us just sounds completely wrong because their scales are so different. So like that would be one way of just going like, even though what are their kind of aesthetic principles of valuation? Like how unique could they be? Like what makes you cry? What is music that you sing? Something like that.
I think, Trip, that you are a disguised form of Friedrich Schleiermacher. You want to get into their psyche and get to the experience that he would call the feeling of absolute dependence. It's right there with the metaxy, where we finite creatures are wondering about the infinite. And I think what you want to do is get to that question through what they cried about most recently. And I think I do too. I would want to follow that path. It might start out differently, but that's where I'd want to end up.
Well, I take a Schleiermacher. That's a compliment. Um, so, one way we might encounter intelligence that's new is either our own kind of post-biological creation of life that we are a part of. Some more advanced form of AI might evolve that way, or the first encounter is not with the species itself, but technology they send, which may have, much more adaptive intelligence than the species itself. Like if it technologically, I wonder, as someone who has spent so much time in this conversation, but also plenty of engagement around AI and things, how does our own kind of current fascination with artificial intelligence and the cultural consequences kind of help you think about encounters with intelligence beyond just life, be it native to our planet or beyond?
That's a very pertinent question, Trip. Physicists such as Paul Davies and Martin Rees alert us to the likelihood, in their opinion, that the first off-Earth intelligence we're going to confront will be post-biological in character. And they do make that argument on the basis of what they expect to be the advance in artificial intelligence here on Earth, artificial general intelligence, superintelligence, or what have you. And it's interesting, in the UFO vocabulary over the last 8 years, since 2017 shift in ufology, now use the term non-human intelligence, so that dealing with extraterrestrial intelligence and dealing with artificial intelligence now have a nice overlap, and we can learn something about the other from one. The debate within artificial intelligence these days is AGI, or artificial general intelligence, human intelligence at a level equal to the human? Is it possible or not? More of the optimists sure say it is. Within a year, some of them are saying, or others 10 years. Then when you and I are talking to our computer and we think there's a self there talking back to us, what are we going to think? And I'm glad that a lot of philosophers are pondering this one, but they don't have an answer. At least they don't have an answer that's been very persuasive to me. My argument up until this point has been the following. Most philosophers of intelligence delete something essential from their understanding, and that is the existence of a self. That if you have just data processing, no matter how fast it is, if there's no self there, you're not talking to what we're used to talking to when we talk to another human being, or maybe our pet husky or a dolphin. And so I haven't really seen that issue addressed sufficiently. And I'm not smart enough myself to figure it out, but I think that question needs to be answered. And I don't see Martin Rees or Paul Davies addressing it sufficiently. So post-biological intelligence could be a great big computer like HAL in the 2001 Odyssey. And I think theologically, it's going to be a non-issue. Now, if it turns out that we meet a non-human intelligence who is a self, then you got a theological issue. And immediately Imago Dei, or the image of God in us, comes to play. There are a number of theologians, and you're certainly aware of this, who think that the divine image in us is our mind, our rationality, and certainly Plato thought that, etc. But, that's highly disputed within the Christian tradition. What really is the image of God that you and I carry around every day? So I think theologians will be earning an honest living too. What that day does. But right now, it's speculative, but it might not be speculative day after tomorrow.
Yeah. The concern of not being able to identify self is something that there's quite a few members of the brain sciences that I'm not sure they could spot us. They're able to spot, or at least notice the self in their neighbor. They're still, they might decide it's a useful fiction when thinking about ethics, but they aren't willing to say anything scientifically.
Right.
Well, one of the other things you talk about is the need to have a single planetary voice in the situation of like encountering another, developed life from another place. And, I might have thought maybe if we went back 50 years, we might have had a better chance of cooperating just as a species on this planet to have a single voice for interacting with extraterrestrials. But that seems more under stress right now, just given the way our different nation states are relating. So how does something like the cooperation of even within our species on our planet need to develop in a way that we could even be a trusted conversation partner with another species, since we're not even necessarily a good one right now as America with Canada, until they become the 51st state.
This is a humdinger of an ethical question, I think. For the last 10 years or so, I've been getting a lot of mileage out of the concept of the common good. When it comes to Earth looking at a civilization that's off Earth, our doctrines such as human equality, social justice, etc., I think mandate that whatever relationship we Earthlings have to extraterrestrials has to be for the best, the well-being of all persons on Earth. And the common good, which I find increasingly a really good idea, I think requires that. And so if for no other reason than we have to relate to on-Earth civilizations, we got to get our act together on this planet so that China doesn't sign a unilateral economic agreement with a planet orbiting Zeta 2 Reticuli that will provide goodies for China and deny them for Angola or something like that. And I grew up in the era of the United Nations. Oh my gosh, we had hopes because the United Nations were driven by liberal ideas, human dignity and equality and justice and economic development. All of these beautiful ideas that, make a liberal or progressive person sleep soundly each evening. But now we're seeing all coming unravel because some of the global leadership lies about supporting these ideals while underneath engaging in unheard of levels of corruption and power-hungry jingoism, etc. So it is apparently disintegrating. Now, these really good ideas, justice, equality, dignity, and freedom, didn't go away. And there may be a number of people in one another or a number of nations who still believe in them strongly enough to try to make them work, etc. But you know what, Trip? I don't know of an alternative other than trying to make them work one more time. I mean, they're not dead. They're very much alive. But right now it's bullets, bombs, and the threat of bullets and bombs in order to make a small number of people extremely wealthy that is ruling the day. And so planet Earth is unprepared to meet extraterrestrials who either are benevolent or violent. Either one. We're underprepared.
Do you think something that has come up in a number of conversations I've had around this has been the kind of grieving that our space program has become privatized, both in the sense of the responsibility for the organizations to the shareholders and that side, but also it ceased to be like a collective dream for particular nation, and eventually like us cooperating with Russia and stuff for the space station and these kinds of things. The dream of kind of exploration of space and everything and stuff that entails is something that has become increasingly swallowed and dependent upon individual companies within the market. Do you find does that give you different ethical concerns than when they were accountable to nation states that are cooperating for the research and exploration?
This is an important issue. I have a couple of friends who are a lot smarter than I am are working on this. Richard Randolph, a bioethicist, Chris McKay at NASA, and I think they're going to try to do a scholarly article on this in the next year or so. I think the first thing is let's point out the lie that is privatized, big lie. The private space companies are still spending taxpayer dollars. They didn't earn those dollars. They didn't make a profit off a product. No, the taxpayers' dollars, they're just picking the pockets of the national budget, at least in the United States. So privatized, no, this is just graft. It's just, it's not.
Which is very trendy these days, Ted.
Huh?
Which is very trendy.
And so the idea that, and we do have the policy of technology transfer in America whereby government-funded programs that develop a new technology can transfer it to private enterprise. It's been a wonderful thing in medical research and other areas, and that could have happened here. But in this case, it's just the government giving out taxpayer largesse to their buddies. Now, having said that, I do want to say that the people who get that graft are pretty smart. We want their intelligence. We want their experience. We want their organizational ability. We want their vision. And so there could really be a very positive contractual relationship between the taxpaying public on the one hand and these very smart people on the other. And to what I just want to say that's the first ethical issue is this giant game of pretend. But then secondly, and I just don't know how those people think about their sense of social responsibility when it comes to a moonshot or a Mars settlement, etc. So that's a long way of saying, gee, Trip, I don't know.
Yeah, well, the impact of Doge on our international support to all sorts of people made me increasingly wary of the decision-making process.
You're saying so nicely, yeah.
Well, it's better than screaming. So what are there particular topics around this that I haven't brought up that when talking about it come up on a consistent basis?
You've drawn upon the whole encyclopedia as I can tell. I think, there's just one, it's a small one. And as you've let everybody know that my work in Berkeley with my colleagues there at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, we work diligently trying to put scientists and theologians and ethicists and Whiteheadians and Thomists in a cooperative situation where we can work together on trying to build a worldview that takes all of these things into account. But there is sectarianism within science, just as there is elsewhere. And one of my concerns recently has been the division between the ufologists who study UFOs or UAP on the one hand, and the astrobiologists on the other. And I have a friend at SETI who every summer has a barbecue. And when I go there, there's nobody there who studies UFOs. Why not? Well, we don't want those people here. They don't do science. Well, if you go to the UFO people, such as MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, and others, they see themselves as scientific organizations pursuing the study of UAP for the benefit of humankind. That's their self-understanding. And since over the last 8 or 9 years, a large number of university and industrial scientists have really taken seriously the UFO matter, devising methods of research in order to gain more and more knowledge, etc. And they're serious scientists. So my question is, why don't ufologists and astrobiologists go to the same barbecues? And in fact, I'm going to have to hold my own barbecue, right? Get out the Weber and invite my UFO friends, my astrobiology friends, and we'll just see if they eat the same hot dogs and hamburgers. I'm not sure.
Well, it sounds like a great party. And you got to make sure you get the really nice local wine there. So that,
Oh yeah, we'll go to
'cause-
Napa, Sonoma Valley, and we'll get the
Yeah.
wine. Yeah,
yeah,
that's right.
it's after the second glass, then they might get along
Well, that's
more.
true. Yeah, the fraternity will rise with each glass of wine. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can just say, look, this is just a very time honored Lutheran tradition.
Yeah, we'll have Jello salad.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. Do you want to let people know where they can check out the center and your Substack
Well,
and stuff
yes,
like that?
I'm a professor retired at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and we have a center there called the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. You can find both of them on the website quite easily. Yeah, tune in, find out.
And let them know let them know your Substack title and such.
Oh, yes. I have a Substack newsletter called The Voice of Public Theology Newsletter. And in there, I do some of the things that Trip Fuller does. I like to do science and religion, the question of advancing technology, especially artificial intelligence, and what its impact will be on society. I have a lot to say about the worldwide political crisis prompted by rogue America at this particular juncture. And I try to keep to the gossip to a minimum, but, a little bit of gossip always adds salt and pepper. So,
Yes. Well, this has been a real treat, Ted. Always good to get to interact with you. And
well, thanks again for your leadership, Trip. And if I may just say, your treatment of Reinhold Niebuhr's children of light, children of darkness applied to the contemporary situation adds the kind of insight that our public discourse really, really needs. And as I think I mentioned, my pastor, Tom Gable, and I are so excited about your work there. We're going to try to lead a discussion or a conversation based upon your insights. So please keep up the fine work, because you're making a genuine contribution to public discourse here through your research, your conversation, your writing.
Well, thank you very much. That's awesome.